What happens when you inject a teenage boy with the king of curses, force him to witness death after death, and ask him to save humanity while questioning whether he even has the right to live? Yuji Itadori's story isn't just another shonen protagonist's journey of getting stronger. It's a harrowing psychological descent into one of anime's most compelling identity crises, and today we're breaking down exactly what's happening in his mind through the lens of clinical psychology. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand why Yuji's mental state represents something far more complex and disturbing than typical hero trauma, and why his question of whether he's still human might have an answer that would terrify him. Yuji Itadori begins his story as something psychologists would call remarkably well-adjusted, almost anomalously so. He's athletic, empathetic, and possesses what positive psychology researchers would identify as exceptional emotional intelligence and altruistic drive. But here's what makes him psychologically fascinating. His core identity was built on an externalized locus of control from the very beginning. His grandfather's dying wish that he die surrounded by people becomes the entire foundation of Yuji's self-concept. In psychological terms, this represents what Carl Rogers would call conditions of worth taken to an extreme. Yuji's sense of self-value isn't intrinsic. It's entirely dependent on his utility to others, his ability to save people, his function as a vessel for good. When he consumes Sukuna's finger, he doesn't just gain cursed energy. He fundamentally fractures the singular identity structure he'd built his entire existence upon. From a Jungian perspective, Sukuna represents far more than a parasitic curse. He embodies what Jung termed the shadow, the repressed and rejected aspects of the psyche that contain everything the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge. But Yuji's situation creates a unique psychological horror because his shadow isn't metaphorical or unconscious. It's literally living inside him, speaking to him, mocking his values, and periodically seizing control of his body to commit the exact atrocities Yuji dedicates his life to preventing. Traditional shadow integration involves acknowledging and incorporating rejected aspects of oneself. But how does one integrate a separate consciousness that represents absolute malevolence? This creates what psychiatrist R.D. Laing called an ontological insecurity, a fundamental uncertainty about the boundaries of self and the stability of one's existence. Every moment Yuji exists, he carries the knowledge that his body might become the instrument of mass murder. This isn't abstract anxiety. It's concrete, justified terror about his own potential for harm. Consider what happens psychologically when Sukuna takes control and massacres innocent people in Shibuya. Yuji experiences what trauma researchers identify as perpetration-induced traumatic stress, a specific form of PTSD that occurs when individuals are forced to commit or witness themselves committing atrocities, even under duress or without control. Combat veterans who experience this describe a shattering of moral identity, an inability to reconcile their self-concept with their actions. But Yuji's case presents an even more complex psychological paradox. He didn't commit these acts, yet they were committed with his hands, his cursed energy, his physical form. From a neuroscientific perspective, his brain must process these memories as his own actions, even though his volition was completely absent. This creates what cognitive psychologists call cognitive dissonance at a catastrophic level. His deeply held belief that he exists to save people directly contradicts the empirical reality that his existence has caused tremendous death and suffering. The psychological defense mechanisms Yuji employs reveal the desperation of his mental state. Initially, he attempts what Anna Freud termed intellectualization, trying to rationalize his role and responsibility through logical frameworks about control and culpability. When this fails, we see evidence of what Melanie Klein described as splitting, dividing his experience into all good and all bad categories to make the psychological pain manageable. He's not just dealing with survivor's guilt, though that's certainly present. He's dealing with what we might call existential guilt, a fundamental questioning of whether his continued existence is morally justifiable given the body count associated with it. Philosophers like Martin Buber discuss the concept of guilt as an ontological reality rather than merely a feeling, and Yuji embodies this perfectly. His guilt isn't irrational or disproportionate. From his ethical framework, it's entirely logical, which makes it far more dangerous psychologically. Yuji's relationship with death reveals another layer of psychological complexity that sets him apart from typical shonen protagonists. Most heroes develop what researchers call post-traumatic growth, finding meaning and strength through adversity. But Yuji's exposure to death is so constant and so intimately connected to his sense of responsibility that he develops what might clinically resemble depersonalization and derealization symptoms. Watch his affect flatten as the series progresses. Notice how his emotional responses become increasingly muted. This isn't character inconsistency. It's a realistic portrayal of dissociative coping mechanisms emerging in response to overwhelming psychological trauma. When Yuji tells Mahito that he's essentially a cog in the machine, simply continuing to kill curses until he himself is killed, he's expressing what Viktor Frankl warned about in his work on meaning. Without a coherent sense of purpose beyond mechanical action, human beings lose connection to their own humanity. The developmental psychology of Yuji's formation is crucial to understanding his current crisis. He grew up without parents, raised by a grandfather who, despite good intentions, instilled a fundamentally other-focused identity structure. From attachment theory, we might observe that Yuji never developed what psychologist John Bowlby called a secure base, an internal sense of worth independent of external validation. His prosocial behavior, while admirable, stems not from integrated self-actualization, but from an externalized need to justify his existence through service. This makes him psychologically vulnerable, in precisely the way his story exploits. When his ability to save people becomes compromised, when his existence begins causing the harm he exists to prevent, his entire psychological foundation crumbles because there's no core self underneath to fall back on. He's constructed his identity entirely on function rather than being. From a clinical perspective, if we were to evaluate Yuji through a DSM-5 lens, we'd likely observe significant trauma-related symptoms. He demonstrates intrusive memories, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and persistent negative beliefs about himself that align with PTSD criteria. His guilt and sense of responsibility show elements of what's sometimes called moral injury, a concept emerging in trauma literature that describes the psychological impact of transgressing one's deeply held moral beliefs. However, it's important to distinguish between having trauma symptoms and having a disorder. Yuji's responses are actually quite adaptive given his circumstances. His ability to continue functioning, to maintain relationships with others, and to persist in his goals despite overwhelming psychological burden speaks to remarkable resilience even as we watch him deteriorate. The question isn't whether Yuji has psychological damage. Obviously he does. The question is how much more he can withstand before that damage becomes irreparable. What makes Yuji's arc so psychologically resonant is that it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about identity, responsibility, and the nature of humanity itself. Philosophers have long debated the continuity of personal identity. John Locke argued that identity persists through psychological continuity and memory. But what happens when your body commits acts that your psychology abhors? Are you still you? Thomas Nagel's famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, explored the subjectivity of consciousness, and Yuji's situation presents an even more disturbing thought experiment. What is it like to be Yuji Itadori, knowing that at any moment you might cease to be the conscious pilot of your own body? This isn't philosophical abstraction for him. It's daily reality, and the psychological toll of living with that uncertainty cannot be overstated. The broader implications of Yuji's psychology extend beyond anime analysis into real psychological truths about human nature. His crisis represents an extreme version of questions many people face about identity, purpose, and moral responsibility. How much of who we are is defined by what we do versus who we intend to be? When our actions don't align with our values due to circumstances beyond our control, how do we maintain coherent self-concept? These aren't just Yuji's questions. They're fundamental human struggles, which is precisely why his character resonates so deeply with audiences. We recognize in his extreme circumstances the smaller versions of identity crises we all face. The difference is that most of us don't have the king of curses living inside us. But we all carry aspects of ourselves we struggle to integrate, aspects that seem foreign or threatening to our self-image. Yuji's relationships provide crucial insight into his psychological state because they reveal both his desperate need for human connection and his increasing inability to maintain it authentically. His friendship with Megumi and Nobara initially serves as psychological anchoring, reminding him of his humanity and providing external validation of his worth. But as his trauma accumulates, we see him begin to withdraw emotionally, not because he cares less, but because he's trying to protect them from the contamination he believes he represents. This is classic trauma response behavior. Survivors of severe trauma often isolate themselves, believing they're somehow damaged or dangerous to others. In Yuji's case, this belief isn't entirely irrational, which makes the psychological trap even more insidious. He needs human connection to maintain his humanity, but his circumstances seem to prove that his connections bring danger and death. It's a psychological double bind with no clean resolution. The question of whether Yuji is still human isn't merely philosophical speculation. It's a genuine psychological crisis playing out in his cognition and behavior. From a biological perspective, he's obviously still human, but humanity isn't just biology. It's consciousness, moral agency, social connection, and self-determination. Sukuna's presence compromises or threatens every single one of these dimensions. His consciousness is no longer entirely his own. His moral agency is questionable given his lack of complete control. His social connections are strained by the danger he represents. His self-determination is limited by the curse inside him. What we're watching isn't a boy becoming physically inhuman. We're watching the psychological dismantling of human identity itself. And perhaps most disturbingly, we're watching him become increasingly aware of this process, developing what existential psychologists call death anxiety. Except Yuji's version is more complex. He fears not just his own death, but what his continued life means for others. Understanding Yuji's psychology teaches us something profound about resilience and its limits. There's a tendency in both fiction and reality to celebrate endless resilience, to admire those who keep going no matter what. But psychologists recognize that resilience isn't infinite. Every human psyche has breaking points, and recognizing those limits isn't weakness, it's reality. Yuji's story shows us someone pushing far beyond what most people could endure, and it doesn't shy away from showing the cost. His emotional numbing, his fatalistic outlook, his diminishing sense of self aren't character flaws. They're the psychological price of bearing an unbearable burden. This is important because it validates the experiences of real people dealing with trauma. You're not weak if trauma changes you. That's not failure. That's the human nervous system, doing exactly what it evolved to do when confronted with threats it cannot overcome. The beauty and tragedy of Yuji Itadori's character is that he represents both the best and most vulnerable aspects of human psychology. His selflessness, his empathy, his determination to protect others. These are admirable traits that stem from genuine moral conviction. But these same traits become the source of his greatest suffering because they make him unable to forgive himself for circumstances beyond his control. A more selfish person might rationalize away responsibility for Sukuna's actions. Yuji cannot, and his inability to do so traps him in a psychological hell of his own making. He's simultaneously the hero trying to save everyone and the prisoner tormented by his failures to do so. This internal conflict, this absolute inability to reconcile what he wants to be with what his existence has caused, represents psychological suffering of the highest order. So, is Yuji still human? From everything we've analyzed, the answer is tragically, painfully yes. His suffering proves his humanity. His guilt demonstrates his moral consciousness. His continued fighting despite wanting to give up shows human will. But he's human in the way trauma survivors are human, carrying scars that never fully heal, functioning despite ongoing pain, questioning their own worth while somehow continuing to exist. His humanity isn't the simple, uncomplicated humanity he started with. It's been shattered, reconstructed, and shattered again. What remains is perhaps more authentically human than what he began with, because it includes the full weight of suffering, doubt, and existential crisis that defines the human condition. Yuji Itadori isn't losing his humanity. He's discovering what humanity actually costs. If this analysis has changed how you see Yuji Itadori's character, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more psychological breakdowns of anime's most complex characters. Drop a comment below telling me what character you want analyzed next, or share your own thoughts on Yuji's psychological state. Does his guilt make sense, or is he being too hard on himself? Can someone in his situation maintain their identity, or is psychological disintegration inevitable? Let's discuss in the comments, and I'll see you in the next deep dive into the minds of anime's most fascinating characters.